The Saffron Robe by Tuesday Love Sang Rampa. Read to you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC, December 2016. Chapter 3. I thought of my guide, the Lama Mingyar Dondap, who had had to go to distant Paris very suddenly. I thought of all the questions which were welling up in me and which only he could answer. Never mind, tomorrow he would return, and then I should be glad to get back to Shakpuri. Here at the Patala there was too much ceremony, too much red tape. Yes, I had a lot of questions which were bothering me, and I could hardly wait for an answer. A swelling noise had been for some moments obtruding on my consciousness. Now the volume of sound reminded me of a herd of yaks in full charge. Into the classroom erupted all the boys. Yes, they were playing at being a herd of yaks. I sidled carefully to the back of the room and sat down close to the wall, out of the way of those who raced around. Round and round they went, leapfrogging one after the other, robes flying, voices raised in shrieks of joy. Suddenly there was a loud whoomph, and a gasp of violently expelled air. Dead silence fell upon the room, with boys frozen into position like carved figures in the temple. My horrified gaze saw the Indian teacher sitting on the floor, his eyes crossed and unfocused with the shock. Now his bowl and barley had been spilled from his robe, I thought with some glee. Slowly he stirred and climbed shakily to his feet, clutching the wall and looking about him. I was the only one sitting. I obviously had had no part in it. Oh, the wonderful, strange feeling to have a perfectly clear conscience. I swelled with virtue as I sat there. On the ground, half stunned or petrified with fright, lay the boy who had dived straight at the spare midriff of the Indian teacher. The boy's nose was bleeding, but the Indian touched him with an ungentle foot and bellowed, "Get up!" Bending, he grabbed the boy by the ears and pulled him up. "Disgraceful, horrid little Tibetan scum!" he bawled, slapping the boy's ears in time to his words. "I will teach you how to behave to an Indian gentleman. I will teach you yoga that will mortify the flesh so that the spirit may be freed." I must ask my guide, I thought, to tell me why some of these great teachers from other lands are so savage. The scowling teacher stopped knocking the boy about and said, "We will have an extended lesson period to teach you that you should be learning instead of being ill-mannered. Now we will start." I called out, "Oh, but honorable master, I was doing nothing at all. It is not fair that I should have to stay." The Indian turned a ferocious face in my direction and said, You would be the worst of the lot. Just because you're crippled and useless, it doesn't mean that you should escape the retribution of your thoughts. You will stay, as will the others." He picked up his scattered papers, and I was sorry to see that the beautiful leather bag with the handle across the top and the shiny button which opened it had been scuffed by contact with our rough stone floor. The Indian noticed it and growled, "Someone will pay very dearly for this. I shall claim another from the Patala." He opened his case and rifled through his papers, sorting them out. At last, satisfied, he said, "We ended this morning with Gautama stating that he renounced his life at the palace, stating that he would continue his life searching for truth. And now Let us continue. When Gautama had left the palace of his father, the king, his mind was in turmoil. He had undergone a most shattering sudden experience of seeing illness when he had not known of illness, of seeing death when he had not known of death, and of seeing peace profound, utter tranquility and contentment. His thoughts were that as the wearer of the contented look was also wearing a monk's robe, then contentment and inner peace would be found in the garb of a monk, and thus it was that he set forth on his search for inner tranquility, in his search for the meaning of life. He wandered on and on into the realms beyond those over which his father ruled, on and on, following rumors of learned monks and erudite hermits. He studied with the best teachers that he could find, studying whenever there was anything to be learned. As he learned from one teacher all that the teacher could teach him, he moved on, ever in search of knowledge, ever in search of the most elusive thing on earth, peace of mind, tranquility. Gautama was a very apt pupil. He had been favored of life. He had been given an alert brain and a bright awareness. He was able to pick up information and sort it in his mind, rejecting that which was useless to him, and retaining only matter which was of benefit and worth. One of the great teachers, impressed by Gautama's readiness and acute intelligence, asked him that he should stay and teach, asked him to become a full partner in imparting knowledge to other students. But this was quite alien to Gautama's belief, for he reasoned, how could he teach that which he did not fully understand? How could he teach others when he was still searching for truth himself? He knew the scriptures and the commentaries of the scriptures, but while the scriptures gave a certain degree of peace, yet there was always questions and problems which broke the tranquility which he was trying to gain, and thus Gautama wandered on. He was as a man obsessed, a man with a burning drive which permitted him no rest, spurring him on and on in search of knowledge, in search of truth. One hermit led him to believe that only the ascetic life could lead him to tranquility, so a rather impetuous Gautama tried the life of the ascetic. Long ago he had shed all material things. He had no material pleasures. He lived only to search for the meaning behind life. But now he forced himself to eat less, and as the old stories say, at last he managed to live on 1 grain of rice a day. He spent the whole of his time in the deepest of meditation, remaining immobile beneath the shade of a banyan tree, but at last his sparse diet betrayed him. He collapsed through hunger, malnutrition, and a lack of elementary care. For long he lingered at the point of death, but no enlightenment reached him. He still had not found the secret of tranquility. He still had not found the meaning behind the most elusive thing on earth, peace of mind, tranquility. Certain friends had gathered about him during the days of his starvation, thinking that here was a sensation, a monk who could live on 1 grain of rice a day, thinking that they would gain great advantages by being associated with such a sensational man. But, like friends the world over, these deserted him in the hour of his need. As Gautama lay near the point of death through starvation, his friends, one by one, left him, wandered off in search of sensation elsewhere. Gautama was now alone again, free from the distraction of friends, free from followers, free to start pondering all over again on the meaning behind life. This episode was the turning point in the career of Gautama. For years he'd been practicing yoga that he might, by mortifying the flesh, free the spirit from the bonds of the body. But now he found yoga useless to him. Yoga was merely a means of gaining a little discipline over a recalcitrant body, and had no great merit in assisting one to spirituality. He also found that it was useless to lead such an austere life, because continued austerity would merely result in his death, with his questions unanswered and his quest unended. He pondered upon that problem too, and decided that what he had been doing was like trying to bail out the river Ganges with a sieve, or trying to tie knots in the air. Once again Gautama pondered as he sat down beneath a tree, weak and trembling, with the weakness which comes upon those who have starved too long, but barely escaped death. He sat beneath the trees and meditated deeply upon the problem of unhappiness and suffering. He made a solemn resolve that, as he had already spent more than 6 years in the search for knowledge without gaining the answer, he would sit in meditation, and he would not rise up again until he had found the answer to his problem. Gautama sat, and the sun went down, and darkness fell upon the land, and the night birds began their calling, and the animals began their prowling. Gautama sat. The long hours of the night dragged on, and soon the first faint streaks of light appeared in the sky. The dawn was approaching. Gautama sat and meditated. All the creatures of nature had witnessed the sufferings of the weary Gautama the day before, as he sat alone beneath the great tree. He had their sympathy, their understanding, and all the creatures of nature considered in their minds how they could help mankind struggle out of the difficult ways into which he had fallen. The tigers ceased to roar that their song and their callings should not disturb the meditating Gautama. The monkeys ceased to chatter, ceased to swing from branch to branch. Instead, they sat silent, hoping. The birds ceased their song, ceased their trilling, and sat instead, fluttering their wings in the hopes of being able to help Gautama by sending to him waves of love and waves of cooling air. The dogs, normally barking and chasing around, ceased their noise and went away and hid beneath the bushes, hid where the rays of the sun should not fall upon them. The king of the snails, looking about him, saw the dogs disappearing in the shade, and the king of snails thought how he and his people could help mankind through Gautama. Calling his people together, the king of snails slowly led the way up Gautama's back, up his neck, and they clustered upon his sun-reddened head, that head so deep in meditation, that head so scorched by the burning rays of the sun. The snails clustered, and with their cool bodies protected Gautama from the heat of the noonday sun, and who knows, those snails, by keeping Gautama's head cool, may have helped him in his final quest. The people of nature at one time were the friends of man. They had no fear of man, and until man behaved treacherously towards them, the people of nature came forward to help man. The day dragged on and on, dragged on with Gautama sitting motionless, as motionless as a carved statue. Once again the night came, the darkness. Once again, with the approaching dawn, there came faint streaks in the light, and then the sun brushed upon the horizon. But this time, the sun brought Buddha enlightenment. As if struck by lightning, a thought occurred to Gautama. He had an answer, or a partial answer, to the problems with which he had been beset. He had become enlightened with a new knowledge. He had become the awakened one, which in Indian is the Buddha. His spirit had been illumined by that which had occurred during his meditation on the astral plane. He had gained insight, and he had remembered the things which he had seen in the astral plane. Now, as he knew, he would be free from the unhappiness of life on earth, free of returning to earth in the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. He had gained knowledge of why man should suffer. What caused it? What was its nature? How could it be ended? Gautama, from that moment, became Gautama the Awakened, or to use the Indian phraseology, Gautama the Buddha. Now he pondered again as what his course of action should be. He had suffered and studied, and so should he just teach others, or should he let them find out by means of which he himself had found out? He worried, would anyone else believe the experiences he had undergone? But he decided that the only way to gain an answer to this was to talk with others, to tell them the good news of the enlightenment which had come to him. Rising to his feet and taking a little food and water, he set out on the journey to Benares, where he had hoped he would find 5 of those former associates who had left him when he was in dire need of assistance, who had left him when he decided again to take food. After a journey which lasted quite a time, for Gautama the Buddha was still weak from his privation, he arrived at Benares, and then he met the 5 associates whom he had been seeking. He talked with them and gave them that which had come down through history as the Sermon on the Turning of the Wheel of the Law. He told his audience of the cause of suffering, of the nature of suffering. He told them how to overcome suffering. He told them of a new religion which is known to us as Buddhism. Buddhism means a religion of those seeking to be reawakened. So Gautama knew hunger, I thought. I knew hunger too. I wish that this teacher would have more understanding, for we boys, we never had too much to eat. We never had too much time to ourselves, and with his voice droning on, long beyond the allotted time, we were hungry, tired, sick of it all, hardly able to take in the importance of what he was saying. The boy who had leapfrogged into the Indian teacher sat snuffling. His nose was obviously damaged, perhaps broken, but he had to sit there with his fingers trying to stop the flow of blood, trying to keep from enraging the teacher further. And I thought then, what is the purpose of it all? Why so much suffering? Why do those who have it in their power to show mercy, compassion, and understanding, why do they, instead, behave in a sadistic manner? I resolved that as soon as my guide came back, I would have to delve more deeply into these problems, which were truly perturbing me. But I saw with considerable pleasure that the Indian teacher was looking a little tired, looking a little hungry and thirsty. He kept shifting from one foot to the other. We boys sat on the floor, all cross-legged except me, and I had to keep myself as unobtrusive as possible. The others sat cross-legged in orderly rows. The teacher normally patrolled at our backs, so that we did not know where he was from moment to moment. But this man, the Indian teacher, he was shifting from foot to foot, looking out of the window, watching the shadows move across the ground, watching the hours pass by. He came to a decision, drew himself up and said, "Well, we will have a recess. Your attention is wandering. You're not paying heed to my words. Words which can influence the whole of your lives for eternities to come. We will have a recess for 1/2 hour. You are free to partake of your food, and then you will return here quietly, and I will resume my talk." Quickly he crammed his papers into his leather bag. It snapped shut with a very satisfying click. Then, with a flurry of his yellow robe, he was gone. We sat rather stunned by the suddenness of it all. And then the others jumped to their feet with alacrity. But I had to climb up painfully. My legs were stiff. I had to support myself by leaning against the wall and more or less pushing one leg before the other. But, the last one out, I made my way down to the domain of the friendly cook monk and explained to him the position and how I, an innocent one, was being punished as well for the sins of the others. He laughed at me and said, "Ah, but how about the young man who was dropping pellets of soot? Is not that the case, that your karma is catching up with you? And is it not the case that if your legs had not been damaged, you might have even been the ringleader?" He laughed at me again, benevolently. He was a nice old man. And then he said, "But go on, help yourself. You don't need me to help you. You've helped yourself long enough. Have a good meal and get back before that awful man loses his temper again." So I had my tea, the same as I had for breakfast, the same as I'd had for lunch, Sampa. The same as I should have for years, Sampa. We Tibetans do not have watches nor clocks. When I was in Tibet, I never even knew of the existence of a wristwatch, but we were able to tell the time by something within us. People who have to depend upon themselves rather than upon mechanical contraptions develop some different powers. Thus I and my fellows were able to judge the passing of time quite as accurately as those who wear watches. Well before the half-hour had ended, we returned to our classroom, returned cautiously, as quietly as the mice which fed so well upon our grain down in the storerooms. We entered in an orderly procession, all except the boy who had a bleeding nose. He, poor fellow, had gone to the infirmary where it had found that he had broken his nose. So I had the task of presenting to the Indian teacher a cleft stick in which was wedged a piece of paper bearing the reason wherefore the boy, now a patient, could not be present. The others sat, and as we waited, I, standing with my back against the wall, bearing the stick in my hand, idly fiddling with the fluttering paper in the end. Suddenly the Indian teacher appeared in the doorway and glowered at us, and then he turned and scowled at me. "You, boy, you! What are you doing there playing with a stick?" he asked. "Sir," I replied with some trepidation, "I bear a message from the infirmary." I extended the stick in his direction. For a moment it looked as if he had not the faintest idea what he should do. Then suddenly he snatched the stick with such a jerk I almost fell on my face. Dropping the stick, he took the paper and read it. As he did so, his scowl deepened. Then he screwed up the piece of paper and flung it away from him, a grave offense to us Tibetans, for we regarded paper as sacred, because it was through the medium of paper that we were able to read history. And this man, this Indian sage, had thrown away sacred paper. "Well, what are you standing there gawping for?" I looked at him and gawped more, for I saw no sense in the way he was going on. If he was a teacher, then I decided I did not want to be a teacher. Roughly, he motioned for me to get out of sight and sit down. I did so, and he stood again before us and started to talk. As he told us, Gautama had found a different way of approaching reality, a way in which was called the middle way. The experiences of Gautama had certainly been twofold: born as a prince, with the utmost in luxury and comfort, with an ample supply of dancing girls. The Indian teacher's eyes grew wistful. And all the food he could eat, all the pleasures he could absorb, and then, from that to abject poverty, suffering, reaching almost to the point of death by privation, starvation. But as Gautama readily understood, neither the riches nor the rags had the key to man's eternal problem. The answer, therefore, must lie between them. Buddhism is often regarded as a religion, but it is not a religion in the strict sense of that word. Buddhism is a way of life, a code of living, whereby, provided one follows the code precisely, certain results may be obtained. For convenience, Buddhism may be called religion, although to those of us who are true Buddhist priests, religion is the wrong term. The only term is the middle way. Buddhism was founded from the teachings of the Hindu religion. The Hindu philosophers and religious teachers had taught that the way to knowledge of self, knowledge of the spirit, and the tasks confronting mankind were as one walking along the edge of a razor, where the slightest leaning to one side or the other would cause one to topple. Gautama knew all the Hindu teachings, for he was at the start of his life a Hindu. But by his own perseverance, he discovered a middle way. Extreme self-denial is bad. It leads one to a distorted viewpoint. Extreme indulgence is equally bad, for it equally leads to a distorted viewpoint. One can, with profit, regard the conditions as those existing in tuning a stringed instrument. If one over-tightens the string of an instrument, such as a guitar, eventually it reaches breaking point, so that the slightest touch will cause the string to snap, and there is, therefore, in this over-tightening, a lack of harmony. If one releases all tension on the strings of the instrument, one again finds that there is a lack of harmony. One can only get harmony when the strings are correctly and quite rigidly tuned. That is as it is in the case of humanity, where indulgence or over-suffering causes lack of harmony. Gautama formulated the belief in the middle way and worked out the precepts whereby one can attain happiness, for one of his sayings was, "Happiness he who seeks may win, if he practices the seeking." One of the first questions which a person asks is, "Why am I unhappy?" It is the question most often asked. Gautama the Buddha asked why he was unhappy. He pondered and thought of the thing and thought around the thing. He came to the conclusion that even a newborn baby suffers. A newborn baby cries because of the ordeal of being born, because of the pain and the lack of comfort in being born and leaving the comfortable world which it knew. When babies are uncomfortable, they cry. And as they grow older, they may not cry, but they still find ways of giving voice to their displeasure, to their lack of satisfaction, and to their actual pain. But a baby does not think about why he cries, he just cries. He just simply reacts like an automaton. Certain stimuli cause a person to cry. Other stimuli cause a person to laugh. But suffering, pain, becomes a problem only when people ask, why do I suffer? Why am I unhappy? Research has revealed that most people have suffered to some extent by the time they're 10 years of age, and they have also wondered why they have had to suffer. But in the case of Gautama, this question did not arise until he was 30 years of age, for the parents of Gautama had done everything they could to stop him enduring suffering in any form whatever. People who have been overprotected and overindulged do not know what it is to face unhappiness, so that when unhappiness eventually is thrust upon them, they're not in a position to deal with the matter, and often they have a mental or a nervous breakdown. Every person at some time has to face suffering and face the reason for suffering. Every person has to endure physical or mental or spiritual pain, for without pain there could not, upon earth, be any learning. There could not be any purification or driving away of the dross which at present surrounds the spirit of man. Gautama did not found a new religion. The whole of the teaching of Gautama, the whole of Gautama's contribution to the total of human knowledge is focused on or about the problem of pain or of happiness. During his meditation, while the creatures of nature remained quiet that he might meditate unmolested, and while the snails cooled his sun-heated head, Gautama realized pain, realized the reason for suffering, and came to believe that he knew how suffering could be overcome. He taught these things to his 5 associates, and the things he taught became the 4 principles upon which the whole of the Buddhist structure rests. These are the 4 noble truths with which we shall deal with later. The shades of night were falling. Darkness was descending so rapidly that we could scarcely see one another. The Indian teacher loomed against the window. His outline showed in the faint starlight. He continued talking, forgetful or uncaring of the fact that we boys had to be up for midnight service. We had to be up for the 4 o'clock service, and then we had to be up again at 6 in the morning. At last, he seemed to realize that he was getting tired. He seemed to realize that standing there in the darkness with his back to the starlight, he was perhaps wasting time, because he could not see us. He could not know if we were paying attention or if we were sleeping as we sat. Suddenly he slapped his hand on the lectern with a resounding thwang. The noise was shattering, unexpected, and we all jumped with fright, so that there must have been several inches of air between our bodies and the floor. Then we all fell back with dull, soggy thuds and grunts of surprise. The Indian teacher stood there for a few moments, and then he said, "Dismiss," and strode out of the room. It was easy for him, I thought. He was just a visitor. He had special privileges. There was no one to call him to task. He could now go to his cell and rest for the whole night if he wanted to. Well, we had to go to temple service. We climbed stiffly to our feet, and I was the stiffest of all. Then we stumbled out of the dark room into the darker corridor. It was not usual for our classes to be held at such an hour, and there were no lights. The corridors were familiar to us, however, and we trudged along until we came to one of the main corridors, which, of course, was lit by the inevitable flickering butter lamps. The butter lamps which were set in niches in the wall at head level, and which it was a constant task of 2 monks to keep filled with butter and to tend the wick which floated on the surface of the liquid butter. We stumbled on up to our dormitory, where we fell upon the floor without more ado, trying to gain a little sleep before the trumpets and the conches should call us to the midnight service. Chapter 4. I crouched below the great ramparts, making myself into a tightly curled ball while I tried to peer through a slight opening. My legs were raging, searing bars of fire, which I was afraid would erupt blood at any moment. But I had to stay, had to endure the discomfort of lying cramped and frightened while I tried to scan the far horizon. Here, in my present position, I was almost on top of the world. I could get no higher without taking wings, or, the thought appealed to me, being lofted by some mighty kite. The wind swirled and howled about me, tearing at the prayer flags, moaning under the roofs of the golden tombs, and every now and then blowing a rain of fine mountain dust on my unprotected head. Early in the morning I had stolen out, and with fear and trembling made my secret way through little used corridors and passages. Stopping to listen every few steps, I had, with extreme caution, at last emerged upon the sacred roof, the roof where only the inmost one and his very closest friends were free to go. Here was danger. My heart throbbed anew at the thought of it. Here, if I were caught, I would be expelled from the order in the most dire disgrace. Expelled? What should I do then? Panic welled within me, and for a long moment I was on the point of fleeing down to the lower regions where I belonged. Common sense prevented me to go down now, with my mission unaccomplished. It would be failure indeed. Expelled in disgrace? What should I do? I had no home. My father had told me that home was not home to me any longer. I must make my own way in life. My wandering eye caught the sparkle of the happy river, sought the dark boatman in his yak-hide boat, and my mind cleared. That's what I would do. I would be a boatman. For greater security I edged along the golden roof, safe now even from the sight of the inmost one, should he venture out in this wind. My legs trembled with the strain, and hunger rumbled within me. A patter of rain solved one problem. I bent and moistened my lips on a small pool that had formed. Would he never come? Anxiously I scanned the distant horizon. Yes, I rubbed my eyes with the backs of my hands and stared again. There was a little cloud of dust from the direction of Paris. Forgotten for the moment was the pain in my legs. Forgotten, too, was the ever-present danger of being seen. I stood and stared. Far, far away, a little group of horsemen was approaching along the valley of Lhasa. The storm was increasing, and the cloud of dust raised by the horses' hooves was whipped away almost as soon as it was formed. I peered and peered, trying to shield my eyes from the cutting wind, and still not miss anything. The trees were bending away from the gale. Leaves fluttered madly, then broke away and raced wind-borne off into the unknown. The lake by the Serpent Temple was no longer mirror placid. Seething waves surged along to break madly against the far bank. Birds, wise to the ways of our weather, walked cautiously to shelter, always keeping head to wind. Through the strings of prayer flags, now almost breaking tight with the pressure, came a direful thrumming, while from the great trumpets, fastened to the roof below, came hoarse bellowings as the wind ebbed and swirled around their mouthpieces. Here, on the very highest part of the golden roof, I could feel tremors, strange scrapings, and sudden splats of ancient dust driven from the rafters below. A horrid premonition, and I turned uneasily in time to glimpse a ghastly black figure rushing upon me. Clammy arms wound around me, choking me, striking me violent blows. I couldn't scream, I had no breath. A black cloud enveloped me, making me retch with the vile odor. No light, just shrieking darkness and smell. No air, just that nauseous gas. I shuddered. My sins had found me out. An evil spirit had attacked me and was about to carry me off. Oh, I muttered, why did I disobey the law and climb to sacred ground? Then my bad temper got the upper hand. No, I would not be carried off by the devils. I would fight, and fight anyone at all. Frantically, in blind panic and furious temper, I lashed out, tearing great chunks out of the devil. Relief flooded through me, and I laughed, that high-pitched laugh of near hysteria. I'd been frightened by an old goatskin tent, rotten with age, which had been blown at me by the wind. Now its shreds were being carried in the direction of Lhasa. But the storm had the last word. With a triumphant howl, a great gust arose which slid me along the slippery roof. My scrabbling hands sought in vain for a hold. I tried to force myself tighter to the roof, but all to no avail. I reached the very edge, teetered, and fell, feather-light, into the astonished arms of an old lama, who gaped open-mouthed at me as I appeared, it seemed to him, from the sky itself, borne on the wind. As was the way of the storms of Lhasa, all the tumult and commotion had died. The wind was lulled, and now merely sighed wistfully around the golden eaves, and played gently with the great trumpets. Overhead, the clouds still raced over the mountains, and were whipped to shreds with the speed of their passing. I was not so calm, though. There was much storm within me. Caught, I muttered to myself. Caught like the biggest ninny in the lamasery. Now I'll have to be a boatman or a yak herder. Now I'm really in trouble. "Sir," I said in a quavering voice, "Lama custodian of the tombs, I was—" "Yes, yes, my boy," said the old Lama soothingly. "I saw it all. I saw you born from the ground by the gale. You are blessed of the gods." I looked at him. He looked at me. Then he realized he was still holding me in his arms. He had been too stunned with surprise to think about it before. Gently he put me down. I stole a glimpse in the direction of Paris. No, I could not see them now. They must have stopped. "Honorable custodian," a voice bawled, "did you see that boy flying over the mountain? The gods took him. Peace be to his soul." I turned around. Framed in a small hatchway was a rather simple old monk named Timon. Timon was one of those who swept the temples and did odd jobs. He and I were old friends. Now, as he looked at me and recognized me, his eyes were wide in astonishment. "The Blessed Mother Dulma protect you," he exclaimed. "So it was you. A few days ago the storm blew you off this roof, and now another storm puts you back. 'Tis indeed a miracle." "But I started to say, but the old Lama broke in. "Yes, yes, we know, we saw it all. I came in the course of my duties to see that all was well, and you flew up over the roof before me." I felt a bit gloomy, so they thought a rotten old goatskin tent, tattered and frayed, was me. Oh well, let them think it. Then I thought how I had been frightened, how I had thought evil spirits were fighting me. Cautiously, I looked about to see if any of the old tent was in sight. No, I'd shredded it in my struggles, and all the bits had blown away. "Look, look!" shrieked Timon. "There's proof! Look at him! Look at him!" I looked down at myself and saw I had a string of prayer flags twisted around me. Clutched in my hand, I still grasped half a flag. The old Lama clucked and clucked and clucked and led the way down. But I turned abruptly and rushed to the wall, peering out again over the ramparts, hoping to see my beloved guide, the Lama Mingyar Dondap, coming into sight in the far distance. But the far distance was blotted out completely by the raging storm, which had left us and was now sweeping down the valleys, leaving flying dust, flying leaves, and no doubt the remnants of the old goatskin tent. The old custodian of the tombs came back and peered over the ramparts with me. "Yes, yes," he said, "I saw you come up the other side of the wall. You were fluttering in front of me, supported on the wind, and then I saw you fall on the very highest pan of the golden tomb roof. I could not bear to look. I saw you struggling to maintain your balance, and I covered my eyes with my hand." A good thing, too, I thought, or you'd have seen me fighting off the old goatskin tent, and then you would have known that I'd been up there all the time, and then I should have been in for trouble. There was a babble of conversation as we turned and went through the doorway leading to the other buildings below. A babble of conversation. There were groups of monks and lamas, each one testifying that they had seen me scooped up from the lower reaches of the mountain path and lifted straightway up, flapping my arms. They had thought that I was going to be crushed against the walls or blown straight over the patella. Not one of them had expected to see me alive again. Not one of them had been able to discern through the dust and stinging wind that it was not I being lofted, but part of an old goatskin tent. "Aye," said one, "I saw it myself, with my very own eyes. There he was, on the ground, sheltering from the wind, and poof, Suddenly he was flying over my head, with his arms aflap. I never thought I'd seen the like of it. Yes, yes, said another. I was looking out the window, wondering at the commotion, and just as I saw this boy blown towards me, I got my eyes full of dust. He nearly kicked my face as he passed. That's nothing, cried a third. He did strike me, nearly buffeted my brains out. I was out in the parapet, and he came flying by me. I tried to grab him, and he nearly tore my robe off. Pulled it right over my head, he did. I was blinded, couldn't see a thing for a time. When I could, he was gone. Ah, well, I thought his time has come, but now I see he's still here. I was passed from hand to hand, much as I was a prize-winning butter statue. Monks felt me, lamas prodded me, but no one would let me explain that I had not been blown onto the roof, but almost blown off. A miracle, said an old man who was on the outskirts, and then, oh, look, here comes the Lord Abbot. The crowd respectfully made way for the golden-robed figure who now appeared among us. "What is this?" he asked. "Why are you so congregated together? Explain it to me," he said as he turned to the most senior lama present. At some length, and with much help from the constantly growing crowd, the matter was explained. I stood there, wishing the floor would open up and drop me down to the kitchen. I was hungry, having had nothing to eat since the night before. "Come with me," commanded the Lord Abbot. The senior lama took an arm and helped me, for I was tired, frightened, aching, and hungry. We went into a large room which I had not previously seen. The Lord Abbot seated himself and sat in silence as he thought of that which he had been told. "Tell me again, omitting nothing," he said to the Lama. So once again I heard of my marvelous flight from the ground to the tomb of the Holy One. Just then my empty stomach gave a loud warning rumble that it needed food. The Lord Abbot, trying not to smile, said, "Take him so that he may eat. I imagine that his ordeal has strained him. Then call the Honorable Herbalist Lama Chin to examine him for injuries, but let him eat first." Food, it tasted good. "You certainly have an up-and-down life, Lobsang," said the friendly cook monk. "First you get blown off the roof and thrown down the mountain. Now they tell me you've been blown from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the roof. An up-and-down life, and the devil looks after his own." Off he went, chuckling at his own wit. I didn't mind. He was always kind to me and helped me in many little ways. Another friend greeted me. A rasping, roaring purr and a hearty butt against my legs made me look down. One of the cats had come to claim his share of my attention. Idly, I let my fingers trail up and down his spine, making him purr louder and louder. A slight rustle from the direction of the barley sacks, and he was gone like a flash, silently. I moved to the window and peered out over Lhasa. No sign of the small party led by my guide, the Lama Mingyar Danda. Had he been caught up by the storm, I wondered? Wondered, too, how much long before he would be returning. "Tomorrow, then, eh?" I turned. One of the kitchen hangers-on had been saying something, and I caught only the end of it. "Yes," said another, "they're staying at the Rose Fence tonight and returning tomorrow." "Oh," I said, "are you talking about my guide, the Lama Mingyar Danda?" Yes, it seems that we shall have to put up with you for yet another day, Lobsang, said one of the hangers-on. But that reminds me, the Honorable Infirmary is waiting for you. You'd better hurry. I slouched gloomily off, thinking that there were too many troubles in the world. Why should my guide have to stop on his journey and stay perhaps another day and night at the Rose Fence lamasery? At that stage of my existence, I thought that only my affairs were of any importance, and I did not fully realize the great work that the Lama Mingyar Dondup was doing for others. I slouched along the corridor to the infirmary office. He was just coming out, but as he saw me, he grabbed my arm and led me back. Now what have you been doing? There's always some incident or item whenever you come to the Patala. I moodily stood before him and told him only that which eyewitnesses had seen about the wind and about the great storm. I did not tell him that I was already on the golden roof, for, as I knew, his first thought would be to report it to the inmost one. Well, take off your robe. I have to examine you for injuries, and then I have to give a report on your condition. I shrugged off my robe and threw it on the bench. The infirmary knelt and probed and prodded to see if I had any bones broken or muscles torn. He was rather surprised that my only injuries, apart from my damaged legs, were that I was covered with black and blue bruises, some with yellow overtones. Here, take this and rub it well into yourself, he said, standing up and reaching to a high shelf and bringing down a leather jar full of some herbal ointment which had a most powerful stink. Do not rub it on here, he said. I do not want to be gassed out. They're your bruises after all. Honorable Infirmary, I said, is it true that my guide is having to stop at the Rose Fence lamasery? Yes, he's having to treat an abbot there, and I do not expect that he'll be returning here until late tomorrow. So we have to put up with you a while longer, he said, and then added slyly, you will be able to enjoy the lectures by our respected Indian teacher visitor. I looked at him, and the thought occurred to me that the old infirmary had no greater love for that Indian teacher than I had. However, there was no time now to deal with that. The sun was directly overhead, and it was time I was going to our lecture hall again. First I went to the dormitory, where I stripped off my robe and rubbed in the stinking ointment. Then I wiped my hands on my robe, put it on again, and made my way back to the lecture hall, taking my place at the back as far away from the Indian teacher as I could. The other boys came in, small boys, medium-sized boys, and big boys, all crammed in together because this was a special event, a visit by a very noted Indian teacher, and it was thought that we boys would profit by hearing Buddhism as taught by another culture. As we sat waiting for the teacher, boys were audibly sniffing. The ones near me moved away, so by the time the teacher arrived, I was sitting in solitary splendor against the wall, with a semicircle of boys not closer than about 12 feet. The Indian teacher came in, carrying his delightful little leather bag, but sniffing, looking about him suspiciously. His nostrils were working, and he was sniffing very audibly. Halfway between the door and the lectern, he stopped and looked about. Then he saw that I was sitting alone. He came towards me, but soon retreated. The room was quite warm, with so many boys in it, and with warmth the ointment was becoming more and more pungent. The Indian teacher stopped, put his hands on his hips, and he glared at me. "My boy, you are the biggest troublemaker in this whole country, I believe. You upset our beliefs by flying up and down the mountainside. I saw it all from my own room. I saw you going up in the distance. You must have devils teach you in your odd moments or something. And now, oh, you stink." "Honorable Indian teacher," I replied, "I cannot help the stench. I'm merely using ointment prescribed by the Honorable Infirmary, and it is much the worse for me because the stuff is fairly bubbling out of me." Not a flicker of a smile crossed his lips. He just turned contemptuously aside and moved to the lectern. "We must get on with our lectures," said the Indian teacher, "for I shall be very glad to leave you and journey onwards to more cultured India." He arranged his papers, shuffled around a bit, looked suspiciously at all of us to see if we were paying attention, and then continued. "Gautama, in his wanderings, had thought a lot. For 6 years he had wandered, spending most of his time searching for truth, seeking for truth, seeking the purpose behind life. As he wandered, he suffered hardships, suffered privation, hunger, and one of his first questions was, 'Why am I unhappy?' Gautama pondered the question incessantly, and the answer came to him when the creatures of nature were assisting him, the snails cooling his head, the birds fanning his brow, and all the others keeping quiet that he should not be disturbed. He decided that there were 4 great truths, which he called the 4 noble truths, which were the laws of man's stay on earth. 'Birth is suffering,' said the Buddha. 'A baby is born to its mother, causing pain to the mother and pain to the baby. Only through pain can one be born to this earth, and the act of being born causes pain and suffering to others. Decay is suffering. As a man gets older and his body cells are not able to replenish along the familiar pattern, decay sets in. Organs no longer function correctly. Change takes place, and there is suffering. One cannot grow old without suffering. Illness is suffering. With the failure of an organ to operate correctly, there is pain, suffering, as the organ compels the body to readjust to the new condition. Wherefore it is that illness causes pain and suffering. Death is the end of illness. Death causes suffering, not the act of dying itself, but the conditions which bring about death are in themselves painful. Therefore again we are unhappy. Suffering is caused by the presence of objects which we hate. We are kept in tension, in frustration, by the presence of those we dislike. We are made unhappy by the separation of objects we love. When we are parted from a dear one, perhaps with no knowledge of when we are going to be with that person again, then we suffer pain, we suffer frustration, wherefore we are unhappy. To desire and not to obtain that which we desire, that is the cause of suffering. That is the cause of unhappiness, the loss of happiness, the cause of misery. Wherefore it is that, as we desire and do not obtain, then instead we suffer and are unhappy. Death only brings peace. Death only brings release from suffering. Wherefore it is clear that clinging to existence is clinging to suffering. Clinging to existence is that which makes us unhappy. The Indian teacher looked at us and said, "The Buddha, our blessed Gautama, was not pessimistic, but realistic. Gautama realized that until one can accept facts, one cannot banish suffering. Until one can understand why there is suffering, one cannot progress along the middle way." The teaching stressed a lot about suffering, I thought, but I remembered what my own dear guide, the Lama Mingyar Dandap, had said to me. He said, "Let us, Lobsang, consider what Gautama really did say. He did not say that everything causes suffering. No matter what the scriptures say, no matter what the great teachers say, Gautama at no time stated that everything is suffering. He really said that everything holds the possibility of suffering, from which it is clear that every incident of life can result in pain or discomfort or disharmony. Can. It is nowhere stated that everything must cause pain. There is so much misunderstanding about what great men did or did not say. Gautama had the belief that suffering, pain, went far beyond mere physical suffering, mere physical pain. He emphasized at all times that the sufferings of the mind through the dysfunction of the emotions was a greater suffering, a greater disharmony than any mere physical pain or unhappiness could cause. Gautama taught, if I am unhappy, it is because I am not living happily, because I am not living in harmony with nature. If I am not living harmoniously, it is because I have not learned to accept the world as it is, with all its disadvantages and possibilities of suffering. I can only attain happiness by realizing the causes of unhappiness and avoiding those causes. I was busy thinking of this and thinking of what an awful stink that ointment was causing when the Indian teacher slapped his lectern again and said, "This is the first of the noble truths. Now let us deal with the second of the noble truths." Gautama gave his sermon to his disciples, those who had previously left him, when much of the sensation had gone from the teaching, but now they were Gautama's disciples again. He said to them, "I teach only two things, suffering and release from suffering. Now this, the noble truth as to the origin of suffering. It is the craving thirst that causes the renewal of becomings. The craving thirst is accompanied by sensual delights and seeks satisfaction now here, now there. It takes the form of craving for the gratification of the senses, or the craving for prosperity and worldly possessions. As we were taught, suffering follows something which we've done wrongly. It is the result of a wrong attitude towards the rest of the world. The world itself is not a bad place, but some of the people in it make it appear bad, and it is our own attitude, our own faults, which make the world seem so bad. Everyone has desires or cravings or lusts which make one do things which, in a more balanced mood, when free from such cravings and lusts, one would not do. The great teaching of the Buddha was that he who craves cannot be free, and a person who is not free cannot be happy. Therefore, to overcome craving is to take a big step forward towards happiness. Gautama taught that every person has to find happiness for himself. He said that there is a happiness that does not give contentment. It is merely a transient thing, and it is the type of happiness which a person obtains when he or she wants change always wants to flit around, seeing fresh sights, meeting fresh people. That is transient happiness. The true happiness is that which gives one deep contentment, gives one's soul release from dissatisfaction. Gautama said, "When in following after happiness I have perceived that bad qualities develop and good qualities were diminished, then that kind of happiness is to be avoided. When following after happiness I have perceived that bad qualities were diminished and good qualities were developed, such happiness is to be followed." We then have to stop chasing about after the idle things of the flesh, the things which do not endure into the next world. We have to stop trying to satisfy cravings which grow the more we feed them, and instead we have to think, what are we really looking for? How shall we find it? We have to think of the nature of our cravings, the cause of our cravings, and having known the cause of our cravings, then we can seek to remove that cause. Our teacher was warming up to his subject. He was being a little troubled, too, by the smell of herbal ointment, for he said, "We will have a recess for the moment because I do not want to overstrain your mentality, which, I perceive, is not at all the mentality of my Indian students." He picked up his papers, put them in his case, carefully snapped the lock, and held his breath as he walked by me. For a few moments the other boys sat still, waiting for his footsteps to die away in the distance. Then one turned to me and said, "Whew, Lobsang, you stink. It must be because you've been mixing with devils, flying up and down to heaven with them." I replied quite reasonably, "Well, if I have been mixing with devils, I should not be flying to heaven with them, but the other way. As everyone knows, I flew up." We dispersed and went our way. I went to the window and looked out pensively, wondering what my guide was doing at the rose fence lamasery, wondering how I should fill the time in with this Indian teacher who I thoroughly disliked. I thought that if he was such a good Buddhist as he imagined himself to be, then he would have more understanding and feeling for small boys. As I was standing there, a young lama came into the room in a hurry. "Lobsang," he said, "come quickly. The inmost one will see you." And then he stopped and said, "Whew, what have you done?" So I told him about the herbal ointment, and he said, "Let us hurry to the infirmary to see what can be done to get rid of that stench before you see the inmost one. Come quickly." End of chapter 4.